So basically, I'm going to be talking about gender equity and Paralympic sport. Based on my experience, as Ella said, playing wheelchair basketball for about 10 years, and you can see a picture of the screen of me at the Tokyo Paralympic Games, and also as a member of the Griffith Inclusive Futures Hub. So basically, the reason that I'll be talking about gender equity is because often sporting organisations consider people with disability to be a homogenous group. But as we shall see throughout this conference, and as Nat already elucidated well, ignoring intersectional inequities not only limits who participates in sport, but puts an artificial cap on our medal chances at the Paralympic Games. So in this talk, I will be specifically focusing on gender inequity and women in Paralympic sport. But it is also important to recognise that women with disability may have other intersectional identities, including race, sexuality, and disability type. So I'll begin by introducing why we need to be considering gender equity when constructing our Paralympic pathways and working towards medal targets. I will then explain how we can use feminist disability theory and intersectionality to conceptualise this issue. I'll give some real-life examples from my research and my own experience as a Paralympic athlete, and finally offer some possible ideas for further consideration. We know that sport in general can have benefits for everybody, including body competence, leadership skills, and friendships. For women with disability, it can have additional benefits, allowing them to build a communal space with others who are going through similar things and face similar barriers, allowing them to share information and experiences and build an essential community. Sport allows women and girls with disability to push the limits of their bodies and challenge the idea that women with disability are weak. However, without proper consideration, gender inequities can have consequences for girls, women, and non-binary people's sense of belonging in sport, as well as negative physical and mental health outcomes. Evidence demonstrates ongoing issues related to experiences of both sexism and ableism in sport. However, the way that disability sport is considered means that the experiences of women with disability is largely hidden. Funding for sport organisations is often tied to one area of disadvantage, such as gender, disability, and culture, without an understanding that people can have several disadvantages that need to be specifically addressed. Thus, to reveal these experiences, we're going to shift our usual lens and question some of the things that we might take for granted or assume. So the lack of women with disability playing sport is a broader issue, but it is also important to consider for the purposes of winning medals. As you can see in this table, our Paris 2024 team was only comprised of 44% women, which was much lower than the Olympic team, which had 55.9% women athletes. This was a very slight increase from Tokyo, which was 43.6% women, but still shows a long way to go to achieve equality. We can see where some of this problem lies by looking at the participation data, which shows a problem with the entire pathway. In 2022 to 23, just 19.7% of women with disability participated in sport once a week or more. This was compared to 33.1% of non-disabled women and 29.2% of men with a disability. So at the elite level, this gender gap's not uniform across all the sports, so it's worth considering where the gaps are and why certain sports may not have as inclusive or equitable environments. In particular, team sports seem to be the most affected, with none of our women's teams qualifying for Paris, including our women's goalball team, which didn't qualify for the first time since London, and our wheelchair basketball team, which hasn't qualified for either Rio in 2016 or Paris this year, despite having significant historical success. And some of that might be my fault, but I still think there's a larger issue there. We also haven't had any women wheelchair tennis players since Rio in 2016, while this year our para-triathlete team had 8 men and only 4 women. While this talk is looking at women in parasport broadly, as we go on, you may be able to see why some of the issues may have bigger impacts in certain sporting environments. So what does the research telling us right now about what it means to be a disabled woman in attempting to access sport? We know there are over 2 million women with disability living in Australia, but the lack of data, research, and information about women and girls with disability results in their invisibility and marginalisation in society, their exclusion and marginalisation from policies, services, and programs, and a critical lack of resources for this group. Sometimes statistics do not reflect the experiences of women and girls with disability. For example, even the data I just referred to was only available for people with a disability over the age of 18 years and did not take into account non-binary genders. We also know that in sport, women and girls with disability tend to receive less support on both an organisational and societal level, with fewer opportunities for sports participation and less encouragement from family. Feminist disability scholars argue that women and girls with disability are often denied access to normative femininity. Instead, cultural stereotypes imagine disabled women as asexual, unfit to reproduce, overly dependent, and unattractive, as generally removed from the sphere of true womanhood and feminine beauty. And of course, these are stereotypes. Without recognition of difference, women with disability are excluded from normative identity categories of women, as defined by this binary thinking. And hence they become invisible in the sport discourses, which are framed by equity as a broad or generic policy. Women with disability also can struggle to push gender norms or resist the gender binary, as they are often required to perform gender correctly to become intelligible as adults and resist the framing of the desexualized cute little disabled girl. These stereotypes have implications for how gendered experiences of disability is addressed in ways that challenge assumptions about how sporting bodies are valued in policy discourse and representations. Sport provision thus needs to shift to value the knowledge of those who are marginalised by overlapping systems of oppression, instead of continuing to prioritise and deeply value only the knowledge of those usually positioned in the centre. So one way we can do this is by using a feminist disability studies lens. Feminist disability studies builds on the social model of disability, which refutes the notion that disability is a medical condition requiring medical solutions, and instead understands disability as the interaction between a person's impairments and social, physical, and attitudinal barriers. Feminist disability studies scholars have argued for a more nuanced understanding of disability by looking at both the material and discursive forces which produce discrimination and exclusion. In particular, they examine the ways in which gender and disability mutually constitute disabled women's experiences and opportunities. And an important concept within this is intersectionality, which we'll probably hear a lot about today. This means looking at the way that multiple systems of oppression, which might be ableism, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, can intersect with disability to shape the experience of embodiment and everyday inequities such as sport. It's important to consider that women with disability are not just women and not just disabled, but rather they meet at the intersection and thus have unique needs and experiences and need to be considered as such. In taking this approach, I conducted research with 8 para-athletes who were in contention for the Paris Paralympic Games. This included athletes from both team and individual sports. However, I will not be revealing the specific sports unless it's directly relevant because it makes the athletes easy to identify. While there were numerous challenges faced by these athletes, I'm going to focus on 4 issues: pathways, mixed gender training environments, coaching, and media coverage. So, the gender inequities in parasport show up almost immediately when entering the pathway, which I'm going to show by telling the story of one athlete, a wheelchair basketballer. She initially contacted different organisations, including Paralympics Australia, asking to play wheelchair basketball, but was told there was nothing available in the state for women. At the grassroots level, wheelchair basketball is often mixed gender, but because there were no other women at the time, she was told no. So for 3 years, she did not play basketball. And then after those 3 years, she went to a come and try day where she was able to connect with wheelchair basketball. However, she pointed out that most of the women presenting the sports at this come and try day were men, whereas most of the people participating were women and girls. This suggests a level of disconnect at the entry point between who wants to play sport and what the sports are actually offering. By that time, There were a couple of other women wheelchair basketballers, and so she was able to start playing. However, because like many para-athletes, she had had her injury late, she was too old for the juniors program, which in women's wheelchair basketball is under 25, and thus she had no opportunities to play and develop. Instead, she'd only played a few games of social basketball when she was taken on an overseas trip with the senior gliders team and thrown very much in the deep end. So another player pointed out that this kind of fast-track development was both gendered and a serious problem for the sport. She said, I think the rollers, which is the men's team, have a lot more people involved, or like the men's side of the game, they have a lot more people involved, which means that their development in the sport maybe isn't as quick. And so they've got to fight for their spots a lot more. While I think in the gliders, they consider it as you're a female with a disability, you enjoy team sport, come along, you know what I mean? It's a little bit like that, and I feel like we lose track of fundamentals of developing people's IQ, figuring out how to be involved in a team environment to begin with. The high performance program then has players at very different levels of skills, which hinders both new players who don't have the chance to learn fundamental skills and experienced players who are held back by athletes not at their level. The pressure can also turn new athletes off the sport or give athletes a level of imposter syndrome as they're touted as the next big thing without having done anything to prove it. This rushed development pathway was something all the team sport athletes identified as limiting the success of the team, whereas in contrast, individual sport athletes were less concerned, understandably considering their own success doesn't necessarily rely on others quite to the same level. And as some of these pathways issues identify, a unique thing about Paralympic sport is that it is not as gender segregated as non-disabled sports. The obvious example is wheelchair rugby, which is mixed gender at the Paralympic Games, but wheelchair basketball athletes also can compete in the mixed gender national league, while most grassroots and junior competitions are also mixed gender. Moreover, due to the low levels of participants, in many sports, men and women train together in a mixed gender environment. Of the 8 athletes in my study, 6 either played or trained with men, including the individual athletes. Most of the athletes saw this as kind of a mixed bag. They recognized that training and playing against men could help them improve their skills and be stronger athletes. However, they also pointed out and expressed frustration that their training catered towards the men. One athlete pointed out that with the able-bodied program, there's a separate women's program and a men's program, whereas when it came to her sport, we have one coach, and she's doing the same program as the para-men. Another athlete was annoyed that even though they had upcoming Paralympic qualifiers, they couldn't access the facilities until the men had signed a training contract. Women are not given specific training programs catered to them, and at worst, they are seen as second-class citizens in these environments. They also felt that when playing with men, it meant that they couldn't play the role that they might play in the women's game, in a women's team. For example, they might be less likely to ball handle or shoot the ball. This means that they were constantly having to adapt to suit the men, and again were not prioritized in the training environment. Athletes also recognize that it could be a quite intimidating environment, especially for new athletes. One athlete told a story of where a girl had stopped attending training because she felt humiliated playing against the guys and came off the court crying. Another athlete said, you have to be pretty tough as a brand new female to any para sport to then be mixing it in with the guys. So I think that's probably a lot of it. And then yet again, due to numbers, you often don't feel safe in a male-dominated environments. You're often just in male-dominated environments, and sometimes maybe that doesn't feel safe. Indeed, safety is often not prioritized in these environments. For example, one athlete said that her mixed gender team shared one change room, and the men would just change their underwear in front of the women. Personally, I've been to numerous local wheelchair basketball tournaments where you see young girls playing on the same team with older men, which has both safety implications, but also means that the girl potentially loses a sense of belonging that comes with playing with girls her own age. While the mixed gender environment might be necessary or even good in some instances, there hasn't really been any consideration for what this might mean for women and girls in parasport. Furthermore, most of the women I interviewed had only been coached by men, and mostly non-disabled men. Many of the athletes felt that the coaches had internalized a protectionist mindset when it came to disabled women, as this quote shows. I've definitely had a lot of coaches where we are women, we're adults, we're not children. So I guess hard in the sense of assimilating to like an environment where you're being treated like a child, or it's almost like you're on a school camp or something like that. Another athlete suggested that having a lot of able-bodied men involved in especially the female side, it's maybe a hero complex, or I'm here to save the day. Look at these poor disabled women. And then there's this very ego-driven in like, well, I'm an expert. You don't know any more than me, rather than being really collaborative, which someone with lived experience, I feel like, has this. In general, athletes preferred coaches who played the sport, and some athletes believed that it was essential to have playing experience. They expressed frustration that coaches were put in charge who didn't know basic fundamental skills and did not understand how their disability might impact their players. For other athletes, if a coach with playing experience was not possible, they suggested that coaches had to be willing to listen and experiment with athletes. They also felt that there needed to be more women involved in coaching and sometimes felt uncomfortable discussing issues like menstruation with male coaches. This was particularly important in sports like swimming, where dealing with periods can turn athletes off the sport. Furthermore, while sport is generally seen as a positive for people with disability, it is worth considering that many of the athletes had also suffered emotional abuse and body shaming from coaches and support staff. One example is an athlete whose team manager ordered everybody's singlets a size smaller, or anyone who she thought should lose weight to be a size smaller, so that they would be motivated to lose weight. In that team environment, there was an unhealthy obsession with weight that rarely corresponded to improved performance. We know that elite athletes in general, and particularly women, are significantly more likely to develop eating disorders or disordered eating. However, this is not a topic that has really been explored in parasport, though my preliminary research and my own experiences suggest that it needs to be further addressed. We do know that para-athletes are at a significant risk of abuse, with one study finding in general that nearly half of the athletes surveyed had experienced psychological abuse, while a third had experienced sexual violence or physical violence. Thus, understanding the way that para-athletes experience body shaming or empowerment through sports is paramount. And finally, athletes believed that the media had a significant role to play in encouraging or preventing women and girls from playing parasport. They were very aware of which athletes were picked for media opportunities and the gender dynamics of this. In asking them who was featured in the media in the lead up to Paris, a number of athletes said a variation on blonde and smiley and vivacious. And if you look at the pictures on the slides, which were taken from the main Channel 9 commercial leading up to the Paralympics, you can see just one woman athlete who isn't blonde. They also pointed out that higher classification athletes got more media opportunities, generally either wheelchair users who could mimic able-bodiedness to a certain degree, or amputees. This frustrated many of the athletes because they believed it didn't highlight the diversity of body types, which is, as one athlete put it, what the Paralympics is all about. Perhaps more importantly, for the purposes of winning medals, it also meant that those at home who did not meet the ideal body type didn't get to see themselves represented, and thus then did not necessarily want to seek out sport or know that it was something that they could do. One athlete encapsulated this, saying, I think they need to start to profile every athlete so that people at home who have the same impairment as us and their parents and allied health professionals and all those sorts of people can see it and go, oh, this is an option. I'd love to be involved. So how do we address these issues? Essentially, right now, we don't have enough research as to how best to target women athletes and improve the experience for women. Participants in my study did make some suggestions of what they'd like to see improve. These include more programs targeted at women, including programs co-designed with people with disability, support for retired athletes to transition into coaching. So in general, the pathways for coaching weren't well defined, and in particular, players were retiring and then simply disappearing from sports spaces because they didn't have that kind of support to transition into a coaching role. Also, support for coaches and support staff to manage mixed gender training environments. which at the moment, the development of these resources is in its infancy and still needs more work. But it also seems to be focused only on wheelchair rugby without recognising that this is an issue for the broader space. Also, a broader spectrum of disabilities and body types in media and promotion, including from the sporting organisations themselves. And finally, define pathways to develop fundamental skills so people aren't rushed to the elite level because there's nothing else available. Thank you.